So, we're looking at Daniel chapter 6 today. If you're not there already, you're welcome to turn there. And we are seeing throughout the book of Daniel the gospel. And today we're going to see the gospel through Daniel chapter 6. Today we're asking the question, what does success look like? And specifically, what does spiritual success look like in our lives? If we're honest, all of us are pursuing success in some way. And many of us are intentionally concerned with spiritual success also in our lives. Sorry, something in my throat. Something that we often have conversations with people in the community, and when they learn that you're a Christian or that you go to church, they often will say something like, well, I don't go to church, but I'm very spiritual. Anybody heard that before? I don't go to church, but I'm very spiritual, right? If I had a nickel for every time I heard that. But for us, the people of God, we often wonder what spiritual success looks like as well. Everybody else around us is searching for it. Even the people that don't go to church, and even for the people that aren't Christian, they're searching for, they know that they're a spiritual being and that they're supposed to be somehow connected to spiritual life, but they're still searching. But what does, for us, a relationship with the creator of the universe look like? What does a close, intimate relationship with Jesus look like? How do I know if my spiritual life is being successful? How do I know if my spiritual life is what it is supposed to be? What if I'm not seeing results from my life with Jesus? What if I'm not seeing people around me follow Jesus more? What if things in my life seem harder because I'm following Jesus? What if many of the things in my life that I've done have become undone? I was watching this guy this week in a video. He was in his 60s, and he was talking about how he followed Christ for his whole life. He followed Christ. He did all the right stuff, even from when he was a young kid. He went to church his whole life. He prayed all the time. He gave money to the church, and then he was talking in this video about what does he have to show for it. In his 60s, he got cancer. And so because of that, he left Christianity in his 60s. There's a girl named Elizabeth who grew up during the Depression, and her family seemed religious. They seemed to do all of the right things. Thanks, Erica. So they seemed to do all of the right things. They prayed, they went to church, they were a religious family, but their dad got sick, and they had 7 kids, Elizabeth being one of the oldest. And their dad got sick, and so they started to pray for him, but he died. And in the Depression, this was not a good time for dads to die. It meant that life would be very difficult for the family. This family that was attempting to pursue Jesus with their life and be faithful to Jesus lost their father. And so that would mean that the mother would have to work hard and the children would have to work hard. Elizabeth would have to go be a maid and bring in a menial income almost for nothing. So was it worth it to continue following Jesus for her? What does success in this life really look like? And maybe one more story. Think about this missionary family in the 1940s. They were the Crusets, and they left their homeland in America and went to China in 1940. And they worked for almost 10 years. They worked for 9 years in China before the communists took over. And they saw very little success for all of their time that they spent in China. But then the Communist Party took over China in the late 1940s and then kicked out all of the Christian missionaries, and so they had to leave. And when they left, there was a small Bible study that they had started with a few new believers. They wouldn't even really call it a church. It was more of a Bible study. And they were forced to leave. And they had to question, man, how would these new believers handle their spiritual life moving forward? How will these new believers continue to know how to follow Jesus? What does spiritual success look like? It looks like this family that left America, left everything that they knew to go be ministers and faithful for the gospel of Jesus to this country of China, that their long 9-year time in China may have seemed meaningless. And today, in our story, Daniel chapter 6, this is one of the most classic children's stories, right? Many of us grew up with this story. If you're like me, you grew up with flannel graphs, right? Before screens were a thing. Anybody remember flannel graphs, right? And Daniel is always like this young kid in the flannel graphs, right? Or he's this good-looking, strong, Jewish boy, right? But that is not Daniel chapter 6. Almost all commentators would say Daniel is really about 82 years old at this point. He's an old man at this point. Daniel has spent his entire life staying true to God and being faithful to God, praying and being devoted to God. But what has it yielded in his life? And many people would look at the life of Daniel and they would say, man, his life has not added up to very much. Yes, he had the big win of winning Nebuchadnezzar over to God, right? Nebuchadnezzar seems to follow God at the end of his life. But then only Nebuchadnezzar's rule would be taken over by other kings, right? And then an entire empire destroying all that Daniel had tried to work towards. And currently, it was under the Medes and the Persians. All that he had worked toward was brought down. And Daniel is still a prisoner in a foreign land. And also, his homeland is still devastated. And we can often feel this way as well. We know we have been faithful to God, but sometimes we feel like, is it worth it? Why continue? What is the hope when life seems so full of doom and sadness? This is where the story of Daniel 6 comes to us today. Daniel is reminding us that to keep our focus away from ourselves and our own faithfulness and to put it upon God. This is the story that is in Daniel 6 today. Focus on God, not on our own faithfulness. So the main points for us today, because we have a God who is sovereign over all, we must trust him to bring hope of his success. So first this morning, we're going to look at verses 1 through 10 that Craig read to us, and we will see we are to live faithfully in hope by trusting when the world is against us. So let's jump into the text this morning. And I should say, let's jump into the story this morning, right? We want to remember that God is teaching us this lesson, and he's teaching us the gospel here through a story. We don't want to leave out the narrative aspect here. Similar to chapter 3, remember from the first lesson that there's parallel passages in Daniel, and chapter 3 and chapter 6 are kind of parallel passages. So similar to chapter 3, both have opposition of state officials, both are accused in a court type of setting, both are dealing with some sort of idol worship, both remain faithful to God, and both of them are threatened by death, thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then God helps both of them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from chapter 3 are pressured to do what their faith prohibited. And here in our chapter, Daniel chapter 6, Daniel is prohibited against doing what his faith requires. So we see this new kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. This is how chapter 6 comes to us, with Darius ruling it. Scholars are divided. I'll just point this out because some people might have notes in their Bible about this. And if you study history, Darius the Mede doesn't exist, right? We don't exactly know who Darius the Mede is. People have a lot of different theories for who he is. But we as Christians would trust the Word of God, and we would say, let the archaeologists keep on digging, right? They will find it eventually. So if you don't know, this pattern happens all the time, where critics of Christianity and critics of the Bible will say, oh, no, it must not be true, right? And then archaeologists keep digging, and they're like, oh, well, I guess we were wrong. The Bible was true, right? Look what we found. Craig shared something with me last week that we were listening to together about they've only discovered maybe 1% of all that they need to in ancient Egypt. 1% of all that they need to. So much more still needs to be discovered about lands that the Bible talks about. Darius is on his throne, though, and 3 people are under him, and then he has 120 people under those 3 people. Daniel happens to be one of those 3 people, and we see that Daniel, just like the other chapters, is more distinguished than the rest of the rulers. And similar to chapter 3, the leaders get jealous because of Daniel's good favor, and they covet what they cannot have, Daniel's good reputation and his good favor. And so they need to make a plan to get rid of Daniel. But unfortunately for them, blameless people are hard to throw blame at. So Daniel is upright and he's hard to find fault with. The only thing that they have against Daniel is that he worships God. I think of the Christmas story, or the Christmas song, "This world treats me mean, Lord. It treated you mean too." This is Daniel's life. Unfortunately, this is a reality for all of us as well. When people know the Bible that we believe, they often are offended by what we believe because we believe in the Bible. The gospel is offensive because it deals with our offenses, one writer says. Oh, that the only thing that people would have against us is what these people have against Daniel, that he worshiped God. Daniel lives among people that are against him and his beliefs and his way of life. But Daniel has done his best to live for God and be a good representative of God in the community that God has placed him in, even though he's captured and kind of a slave to these people. Listen to the instructions that Jeremiah gives to people that were going to be going into exile. This is Jeremiah 29:7. "But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For its welfare you will find. For in its welfare you will find your welfare." So Daniel has been living this out, and he is well thought of by outsiders and people that are against him. You might remember from our sermon last week that one of the qualifications for a biblical elder is that they are well thought of by outsiders. And this reality can be true of Daniel. And though Daniel is living among people that are against him and people that are not his, he is seeking their success as well. He is doing his best to be a good citizen of where God has placed him and be a good representative of God and be a good servant in all that he does. So they desire to make a plan to make Daniel fall with the one thing that he is strongest in, and that's his worship of God. So they go to the king with their crafty minds, and they want to feed the king's ego, and they tell the king that his entire kingdom should be loyal to him, right? And what if we do this for 30 days to see all of the people that are so devoted to our king? And the king has his ego stroked. He likes this idea, so he signs this document. And anyone who violates this temporary 30-day document will be thrown into the lion's den. This is not an unheard of punishment in Persia at this time. This would be a normal way to destroy someone for not following the laws, and it's to make a statement about this person as well. But think about this plan for a moment. They had to be sure that this plan was going to work. They're willing to stake everything, going to the king and making this 30-day plan. But what is this plan dependent upon? It's dependent upon Daniel's faith and his faithfulness. They are so sure of Daniel's faithfulness that they devise this entire plan and stake everything on this one plan. Daniel must have been faithful. And not only was he faithful, but the people around him knew that he was faithful, and they knew that he was not going to keep their law. So after this document is signed, Daniel's response is trusting God through his prayer and devotion. Through his prayer and devotion. He does not change his practices. He does not want to show how holy he is in contrast to the world. Rather, he just continues on doing what he has already been doing. He continues living faithfully and holy for God. He doesn't need to show how his practices are opposed to the world. Rather, the world is showing that they are opposed to his practices and his belief system. Dale Davis says, consistency assists courage, and discipline feeds faithfulness. And in the crisis of Daniel's habits, they free him towards faithfulness. Daniel is old at this point of his life, and we see some wisdom in what he is doing here, and that he is willing to just pray and willing to just trust God. And again, it seems like Daniel had a lot of wisdom, and sometimes it feels like he's reading Paul. Listen to Philippians 4:6. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And this is what real trust looks like. The focus of today is looking at what does real trust look like? What does spiritual success in that look like? Trust is giving up what we think is best and then relying upon God for what he has told us is best and what he knows to be best. Trust is giving up what we think to be best and relying on God for what he knows is best. Even when we are opposed, even when it's hard, we continue working in the world by redeeming the world for the glory of God. We are not elevating Daniel and saying, look at this super Christian, look at how amazing this character Daniel is. Rather, he is a sustainable example for us who was faithful in the small things of his devotion to God and his prayer life. So we say, follow me like I follow Christ. And that's what we're doing here with Daniel. We're saying, follow his example, not putting him on a pedestal saying, look at this superhero Christian that we have. Rather, he's just being faithful. We can be faithful in this way as well. Take note of what Daniel is praying towards here. He's praying towards Jerusalem. And why? Why is he praying towards Jerusalem? This is representative of where his hope is. Though he is in a situation where it seems like doom with people that are against him, his hope is in God and Jerusalem and what God has promised to restore. He knows that God will ultimately come through for him in his life, even if he doesn't see it in this life. For Daniel, the threat of death is little in light of God's hope for him. So next, let's look at let's see the improbable by trusting God when success is improbable, and we'll read verses 11 through 18. Again, these are long passages of Scripture, but we enjoy the narrative because this is how God has chosen to give it to us. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, do not sign an injunction, but that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast in the den of lions. The king answered and said, this thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. And they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or injunction that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored until the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded that Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So Daniel's devotion put him in an unfavorable situation, and that's what we're seeing here. The royal peeping toms and the tattletales, we see Daniel praying, and they see Daniel praying, and they report it to the king. He knew that this would happen. Daniel's not surprised by this. He knew what was going to happen. So they take this report back to the king. And notice the repetition that happens here, that the laws of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked. And we have to ask, why this repetition here? Why does this repetition happen? We know this also from the book of Esther, that the laws of the Medes and Persians cannot be changed. And here, this repetition seems unnecessary, but again, this is a literary device that is being shown to us. That against all odds, when success is improbable and when it seems unreasonable, that this is when God likes to work. The God of improbability and the God of the impossible, these are the situations that he likes to work in. The king is distressed with this news, and he knows Daniel that he's a pretty good guy. He's working for his kingdom. He works as long as he can to try to find a way to change this decree, but he's unable and is forced to go against his will by his own decree and throws Daniel into the lion's den. Then the king leaves Daniel, and he's so upset that he can't rest, he can't sleep, he can't eat, and he's not willing to lean into the diversions that could come his way that are brought to him. And notice for a large portion of reading that the narrative is really focusing on the king and his feelings and his reactions. And we have to wonder why. Why is the focus on the king? Is this story about Daniel, or is it about King Darius? And the narrator is trying to show us something here. That when all of the odds are against us, when the situation seems improbable, who should we be looking to? And the narrator is trying to get us to focus on God. Remember that this is a book written to Jews that are in exile and Jews that are coming out of exile, and they are wondering who should they put their trust in, who should they focus in for these difficult situations that they are in. They had been curious if they should continue being faithful to God, or should they put their trust in the rulers at their time. But they are being told not to put their trust in rulers. This is the reminder that only God can be trusted, not people. This king is made powerless. Ironically, he's made powerless by his own decree. He is the reason for his powerlessness. But God is reminding us that he is faithful. He deserves our trust. He is worthy of our trust. Even the people that aren't hostile towards us and our Christianity are not worth trusting in light of God and trusting God. This is the choice that humanity has been presented from the beginning. Think about Satan and how he tempts Eve in the garden. He tempts her to trust him instead of God, or in herself rather than God. This is an improbable situation that Eve is in, and she's tempted to trust in herself or trust in the words of the serpent rather than in God. Or will you trust in God? Even when it seems like it is not logical, will you continue to trust God in his ways? This is the choice that continues to plague us all. Will we trust God even when the situation is difficult, even when the situation seems improbable? In our heads, this is easy, but when we face difficult situations, that's when it becomes hard to continue trusting. The world asks us for our tolerance and for our acceptance of sin. This path towards God seems illogical when we are tempted with the world. But the Word of God is telling us to keep focusing on God, keep trusting God. It is worth it. Remember the story that I started with in the Depression of Elizabeth? Her life would continue, but it would not become easier for her. She would go on to marry and be committed to the missional effects of the gospel, and she and her husband would go to a foreign land, go to Ecuador to be missionaries. And many of you might realize that I'm talking about Elizabeth Elliot at this point. So her and her husband would take Christ to a people that did not want it, to a people that seemed improbable to accept the gospel, to a people that did not want the gospel. So they found this improbable situation, and they leaned into trusting God and being faithful to God in his ways. And they would take a team to Ecuador, to a violent tribe that did not want the gospel. And her husband, Jim Elliot, would be killed by the very people that he was trying to share the gospel with. And this is a story that in the moment seemed pretty hopeless. Seemed like she had spent her whole life being faithful to God, trying to follow God in his ways, but what did she have to show for it? Difficulty, and now a dead husband. What was the point of all of this? Should she continue living faithfully for God, or should she be like the first guy that we talked about in his 60s that gave up on everything? But Elizabeth did not. She continued to go back to the very people that killed her husband. She trusted God in faithful living in the situation that he had called her to, in a situation that seemed improbable to these people that didn't seem like they were going to accept the gospel. She trusted God and his purposes. Jim Elliot, her husband, is famous for saying, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And because of her trusting the Lord in this situation, and because of her living faithfully to God, many people would come to Christ. Many of these Ecuadorians and these native tribes would come to Christ. And because of God using her faithfulness, many souls would be changed from eternal damnation into the kingdom of God. Sometimes life does not make sense for us. It does not make sense to continue on with what God has called us to. And the path forward seems improbable and it seems impossible. And it seems like a good outcome is highly improbable. And we want to continue to rely not on our own strength, but rather on God's strength, to continue to trust him that his ways are better. Let's finish out the chapter today. We'll read 16 through 28 to finish out. And I meant 19. Chapter 6, 19. Then, at break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve, continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found in him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwelt in all the earth, "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. And who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions? He has saved Daniel." So, this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So lastly, today, we're going to look at trusting God, and we change doom to hope by trusting God to bring his own glory. That's the last point on your notes today. Then we see the rest of the story. So at daybreak, the king runs to the den, and he is clearly anticipating what could become of Daniel, seeing if all of these rumors about Daniel are true, that God is with him. And what reason does Daniel give that no harm has come to him? His actions before God and man, he was blameless. Daniel's name, if you remember from the first sermon, means God is my judge, not man. That's something for us to think about as well. God is our judge, not people. The world can say whatever they want to against us, and they can judge us however they want to, but God is ultimately in charge of our destiny and what happens to us. And if we are following Christ, he has declared us righteous and holy before God by the blood of his Son. And something interesting happens between verse 22 and verse 23. Daniel says that the reason for his rescue is because he hasn't done anything wrong. But then we look at verse 23, and the text says that he is rescued because he put his trust in God. Not himself, but his trust in God. Not his own abilities, but God, who he had been faithful to. His faith was not in his own abilities, but it was in God. And Hebrews 11:23 picks up on this theme and tells us that it is through Daniel's faith that God shut the lion's mouth. That's what Hebrews 11:33 says. And then we get to verse 24, and this is the part of the story that we leave out in the children's stories that we don't talk about, right? In kids' stories, we don't tell this part of the story. We leave out verse 24. That these people and the ones that had these conniving plans, that them and their wives and their children are thrown into the lion's den. Punishment for the entire family. And then we get to verse 24 through 28, and this sounds very familiar to the same way that Nebuchadnezzar had his proclamations earlier chapters, and going to all people everywhere. Rather than have awe and reverence to himself, he is telling them to have awe and reverence to God. He is a living God who endures forever. This is the God who has a kingdom that will never end. Darius seems to realize early on that his kingdom will not be forever and that God's kingdom is forever. One more king has realized that the true and living God will reign forever and that this God is sovereign. This is kind of the theme of the book that we've been talking about, that this God is sovereign. He didn't need the humbling experience of Nebuchadnezzar. Rather, he learns it through the life of Daniel, that this God is sovereign and that we must submit to him and his ways, and that he is deserving of our awe and our reverence. So what are we supposed to do with this information? How does this story change how we live? We trust God to bring about his glory and not our own glory. This is the lesson that Darius has observed and Darius has learned. And this is the lesson that Daniel has lived through. We must realize that following Christ is not a promotional advertisement for us and something that we are supposed to do to have personal gain for ourselves. We live in faith and we trust God. Remember from the first sermon in Daniel that we don't make Daniel the hero of the story. God is the hero of the story. We don't say, live courageously like Daniel. Rather, we say, live courageously because we have a God like the God of Daniel. Daniel is teaching us a hard lesson, that this life is not about us and it's not for us. This life is not for our own glory. This life is meant to be lived for the glory of God. We are called to trust God and to live for him, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, even when it might cost us everything, even when the outcome might not change, even when our life seems really difficult. So remember the story that I started with the Cressettes, the missionaries from America that went to China, and they left after 9 years of ministry, not knowing if anything that they did over there would be fruitful, not knowing if they were going to have success with all that they had shown God, done for God over there. So they left and came back to America, and they prayed for that small Bible study group that they left there for 40 years. Almost 40 years. They didn't know what happened to those people, if the Communist Party had crushed them, or if they had continued to meet in a small house church. They didn't know what would happen to them, but they continued to faithfully pray. I think that that is a good parallel to our story today, thinking about prayer. Continue to pray for 40 years. And then when China put down the walls and opened up to the West again, this missionary family traveled back to China and went to that town to see if that small Bible study was still continuing. And they didn't find the Bible study. They found a church of 4,000 believers there. And this church had started 12 other churches with numbers over 1,000 as well. God was faithful and used their faithfulness in a way that they did not think was possible. And here's the big question for us. Why live faithfully for God if it might not mean anything? We live faithfully for God, not because of our results or because of results for us, but we live for the glory of God. Because it glorifies God. When we live faithfully for God, it is glorifying to him. Even if it appears that there is going to be little ever affected, even if it appears that the dial is not going to move very much, God is still glorified through our faithfulness. And so we continue to put our trust in him. That through the awful yuck of this life and the discouragement that happens, the downsides, the tragedies that happen, God is working through our faithfulness for his glory. God is not calling us to results. He is calling you to trust in him and to live faithfully for his glory. So we'll get to the Beyond the Walls section of this sermon, and we think about grace and growth here. So let's talk about the grace that happens. God has wonderfully worked out this passage a week before Easter, and I'm excited about that. If you have not heard the gospel in this text, you've been fed the gospel without knowing it, so gotcha. Consider Christ, like Daniel, who is falsely accused for something that he did not do. Consider the laws of the Medes and Persians that were unable to be altered. Can you think of any laws against us that are unable to be altered? How about the judgments of God because of our sin? Laws that cannot be changed. But Christ comes to break those chains and breaks those unchangeable judgments that were against us because of our sin. Then Daniel makes it easy for us. Notice that the stone rolled in front of the den, come on, this is awesome, right? The stone that is rolled in front of the den and appears to be sealed, God brings hope to Daniel. The guy who is supposed to die in this tomb that he's in, this tomb that he is meant to go and die in, and Jesus comes to take it a step further. He doesn't just go into the den like Daniel does. He actually dies in the den. This tomb is for real. But he is the greater Daniel in this passage, and he comes to resurrect out of this tomb from an impossible situation. That's what we're talking about today. Improbable, impossible situations. Christ, the Son of God, comes to bring life to a people who are condemned in judgment because of our sin. He, through his life, resurrected and brings hope to the world, even though he died. That is the hope that we all have in this life. This life is not the end. Jesus has already given us hope in this life and in the life to come. So what about growth for us? We might sometimes think that we don't make much of a difference. Is it worth it to continue being a light to my workplace? Is it worth it to continue to pray for this impossible situation with my children when it seems like it's not going to change? Sometimes my devotions feel like they are going nowhere. Sometimes I might not feel like my faithfulness is moving the dial very much. We might feel like leading our homes and family worship is not doing very much. We might think that having a hard conversation with somebody, a Christian, that needs to change their perspective on sin isn't going to have a favorable outcome. I might think that the sin that God is calling me to remove out of my own life is not going to make much of a difference in my life. But let us be reminded, Christ has already changed everything for us. He continues to give us hope in this life and the one to come. We think that there is no chance of change for our boss or for our marriage or our kids or our current situation that we're in, but we put our trust in God and know that he has called us to live faithfully for him. Daniel is living in a foreign land and praying for a kingdom that is not his own yet. And this is our reality as well. We are also living in a foreign land with people that are against us, just like Daniel, and we realize that this is not our hope, that this world is not our home and not our hope. And we put our trust in the eternal kingdom of God and his eternal city that is coming. And though we live in opposition to people around us, we continue to live out the Bible. The words of Martin Luther ring true for us. Martin Luther, who wrote the hymn that is famous, listen to the words of it. Not many songs mention the devil, but this one does. Though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God has willed his truth to triumph through us. The world tells us to give in and that it's not worth it to continue living for Jesus. The stand that we're taking and the devotion to God is not worth it. It will not make a difference. Why be such a troublemaker with people among you? But God is calling us to this life. Daniel is a message of hope for us, that our life matters to God. And oftentimes, I don't hit one demographic with my application. And I think that today in our text, there's a specific application to the legacy adults. We won't call them senior saints, we'll call them legacy adults, right? So the legacy adults in the room, Daniel is a message to you as well. And it's a reminder that age is no barrier to faithful living for the kingdom of God. And we see that in Daniel. Daniel is in his legacy age and continues to be a beacon of hope for the gospel to people around him. And to all of us in the room, this is a message for us to live faithfully for God, so that we look forward to the day when we hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servants." Let's bow our heads and close our eyes for a minute as we respond to the word of God this morning. Take a moment to thank God